I'm so tired, it's not even funny, but we got things to review. So, today we're looking at the Salnotes Dioko by Salnotes. I think Dioko is actually the model name. This is the Dioko planar headset, which makes no sense because they're a set of IMs with no mic on it whatsoever. So, not sure why they call it a headset, but that's not the point of this. These are a set of planar IMs, and they've been specially tuned in partnership with Crinicle, a legendary member in our IM community that many of you may already know. But does that mean these are going to be good for gaming specifically? Because that's what we're going to look at in terms of like what it can do. So with that being said, let's talk about it. Alright, now of course this was sent out to me for review, but this won't affect my review in any way, shape, or form. Everything you're going to hear here is going to be my own personal opinion. And with that being said, let's get started. Starting with the box, it's a box. So let's just open it and we'll find ourselves a nice package. Like, this is a really nice carrying case for a set of $100 IEMs. Like, if we unzip it, we'll also find the inside is also very nice, as everything is nicely padded. But with the case aside, we of course are going to get the IEMs within the case. That of course also come with a detachable cable, a bunch of different size ear tips in different colors in a yellow bag for some reason. It's almost kind of nuclear colored, but you know, whatever. And all that's left is just the manuals. Starting with the cable, this is definitely one of those really high quality braided cables, and you can really tell by looking at it and feeling it. I mean, just look at this quality construction. This is definitely the good stuff. At one end we get a 3.5mm jack that's made of metal and looks pretty well built. Same thing goes for the splitter we'll find a little further up, which of course does have a chin slider, which is rather firm and works pretty well. Finally, at the ends we of course have 2 pin connectors, which are on, of course, ear hooks. Now moving on to the items of the hour, the IMs themselves, which are actually very big and look a lot like jewels if you look at them. At least on the outside anyway, and personally I kind of like this look. Turning to the inside, we will find that they are still fairly large, but at least smaller than the outer side. They of course have the 2 pin connectors on the side, and after removing the ear tip, we'll find that the nozzle is built in one single large piece with the shell on the inside. So these should be very durable, and of course on the inside we'll find a grill to keep them nasty earwaxes out. Now here's how they look like on my noggin, and as you can tell, these are very large IEMs, and they definitely do make a statement on the ears, but at least look somewhat fashionable, though I do think they stick out just a little bit more than I would have liked for like looks purposes, though I'm pretty sure most of you guys don't really care about that. Comfort wise, it surprisingly wasn't bad despite the size and weight of them, because these are entirely made of metal, though I did have to change out the tips to get this a level of comfort, so do keep that in mind. And I was able to wear these things for about 3 hours until I started to feel a little uncomfortable with them in my ears, but of course your mileage will vary. Right, now for those of you who actually follow my channel, you'll probably have noticed that I've been gone for a little bit, and that also means I've been using these a lot. And for the most part, I do like how they sound, with a few exceptions and situations and scenarios. So let's get a little into that. So, well, with planars, as you would expect, they are very good in the mid and high range, and being a like $100 set, I'm not going to expect too much bass from them. Like typically on a planar set, you will expect a very high price if the bass is really good. And when it comes to these ones, it seems that the bass was tuned to be very neutral and balanced leaning, so it's a very nice, easy going, smooth bass. Now mind you, due to the more neutral tuning of the bass, that also means it's not exactly the strongest in the world, especially if you're used to like really bassy headphones and bassy earbuds, which most headphones and earbuds are out there for like the general peoples. But if you're someone who listens to like more balanced tracks, or you enjoy more of a like neutral sound, balanced sound, you'll find the bass to be perfectly adequate, because the bass still is there. You still get a punch, you still get a rumble. It's got a good reach into those sub bass regions, but not like the deepest reach I'd say, but it still has a fair decent reach, and it does pull up a little bit of that rumbliness, gives you a good like just a little bit of a growl. And the punch, I wouldn't say is like the strongest in the world. Some tracks it'll like punch harder, some other tracks it won't, but the punch is still there. Some tracks where I'm used to the punch kind of like having a good hit feels a little bit more soft, whereas on some other tracks where the punch is already very hard, it feels quite adequate. So you know what I'm trying to say is like the punch and the rumble, they're both there, but they're not as like powerful as something that a bass head would usually listen to, and that's the point of this. It's a balanced sounding bass. So while it is weaker, it is still there, and I think someone who listens to like more balanced stuff or isn't too crazy about bass would be perfectly fine with it. A bass head, of course, would probably not like it. They'll find the bass to be kind of, well, they'll find it weak, because a bass head is a bass head. They're not going to look for a neutral bass. That's just kind of how they are. Now on the broadside, due to the tuning of the bass, at least it never bleeds into the mids, letting it really shine, and it also never overpowers anything else in the track, letting both the mids and the highs to really shine. And that's where planars usually like shine the most, because they're often known for giving you a lot of clarity and detail, and these things do that. However, I wouldn't say they give you the most that I've ever heard, because I've heard more detail and clarity definitely being pulled out of the P1 Maxes. These came out more I was gonna say more articulate, but they came off more, there's a word for this, it's analytical. So these are definitely more analytical as it gets very nitty-gritty. When it comes to the Salnotes Dioko, while they do give you a lot of clarity, a lot of like those little details in the sound, I don't think it gives you as much of those micro details, nearly as much as the P1 Maxes, but in doing so, they sound far more natural and smooth while still being detailed, and this makes them a much more enjoyable listen, as these ones, the P1 Maxes, really try to pull out those little micro details and get very analytical with the sound, which is good for some, but I wouldn't say is necessarily the best for just enjoying and just relaxing to music. That's why I think the Salnotes Dioko do a better job, just because of that smoothness that they do with the sound while still managing to give you a good amount of detail. And oftentimes that's seen as kind of like an oxymoron, because when something is smoother and more natural sounding, that usually often means like less detail, but these things manage to do that while still giving you a good amount of detail and texture, and I do like that a lot about these. The highs specifically have a really good reach into the upper range, and sometimes can get a little bit sharp, but it didn't happen too much in music, though it can happen more in games, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. First off, we also got to get into like soundstage and imaging, which I can breeze through pretty quickly, honestly. The soundstage on these guys is larger than average. It's definitely bigger than your regular size IEM like soundstage, and soundstages and IEMs are pretty small, but in terms of IEMs, I'd say it's bigger than average, and it sounds pretty good. It's definitely a lot more wide than it is deep, much like the P1 Maxes and many other IEMs, come to think of it, but the width of this is noticeably wider, I'd say, than it is deep, and this is definitely good in music, but I don't know if that's necessarily good in games, especially when it gets into competitive, which we'll also get into just a little bit later as I get a little bit more into imaging and then into that, or I guess I could talk about them at the same time. So imaging wise, it's okay. It's a little bit above average, but it's definitely not pinpoint due to the way the soundstage is like formed. Like in competitive games, you get a pretty good idea of where things are from a distance, but as soon as things start to get a little bit closer due to the width of the soundstage, trying to figure out and pinpoint where things are from the diagonals gets a little bit more difficult due to the width and the lack of depth. So I wouldn't say these are necessarily pinpoint, and the imaging is just above average, and when things get really close, like you're in the same hallway as an enemy, like, and they're just on the other side of the wall, it's a little bit hard to figure out if they're exactly on the other side of the wall or a little bit left at that point that you're looking at. On the bright side, due to the tuning of the sound, we do get a lot of those details pulled out, so you can really easily like find where the sounds are, or at least initially find where the sounds are, because you can hear them coming at you really quickly. However, when you have to get really pinpoint, they're not the best in the world. They will give you a general sense of where things are, but if you're really trying to track the nitty-gritty sounds, like people are really hiding around places, these definitely aren't the best at doing that, but they'll still give you a pretty good idea of where things are, generally speaking. So if I were to give these things like a rating of 1 out of 10 for competitive shooter games, I'd say it's about like a 6.5 to 7, where it's like better than average in terms of like its imaging and performance overall in games, because of like the nice details you get from like the sounds to help you listen for the sounds to track. But when it comes to directionality of where things are, it could be a little bit better. So, you know, 6.5 to 7-ish, I couldn't decide. Now when it comes to non-competitive games, I think it does a little bit better in that region, because the imaging is more general and you're usually not tracking that heavily in those types of games. But even then, when it comes to the sound, because of its more balanced nature, it's gonna be, it really depends on like how you like your sound. I think for people who enjoy that balanced sound, due to the way these things are tuned, you get a lot out of the sound overall. You get a really good overall experience, because it does help bring a lot of the sounds in the world to you. The soundstage is very wide, so the world also feels very large, but I do think if it had more bass to it, there would be more of that oomph in the sound when you're in these open world situations. So like when it comes to like non-competitive games, it's around a 7 to 8, somewhere around that ballpark. I couldn't decide if I was to give it a score. So I think this does a lot better in non-competitive situations than competitive situations, but honestly, when I really think about it, it's kind of balanced. Like if I were to give them both a score, I guess it's maybe 7 on both ends, unless you're like a person who's like really into bass, because you said that rating for the non-competitives for me. If you're someone who needs more bass for that oomph in the sound for those open world games, you can definitely drop that 8 or 7 down to like a 5 or 6. I'm still working out this scoring system thing. I'm not quite sure how to go about it, but for now, you know, all you gotta know is like for competitive games, these things do like an above average job, but they're not necessarily like the perfect things and the most ideal things in the world, but they still do a fairly good job. Non-competitive games, they are okay, For those who need a lot more bass, I think you're gonna find these not very adequate for those non-competitive situations. But if you have to use them for non-competitive situations, for those open world games, you're still gonna have like an okay time. In my personal experience, I found them to be perfectly fine for non-competitive games until the moment that they weren't. I was playing Terraria and I was taking a whack at these pixies, and they make a very high-pitched sound, and these are very repetitive sounds, as it is the same sound played over and over again if you hit this little pixie many times, and this was tearing my ear apart because it got way too sharp. So do be wary of that when it comes to like the high sounds. It's got a good range, but at a cost, especially when you have games that can do that. It's gonna hurt the ears if you're very sensitive to high. So if you're high sensitive, be careful. Since I've previously reviewed the P1 Maxes by Tin Hi-Fi, I might as well really quickly compare them. Tin Hi-Fi, it's more analytical and it does a lot better in competitive shooters than the Salnotes Dioko, but when it comes to non-competitive, I think the Soundstage Dioko does a better job personally for me, but I think some people would still enjoy the Tin Hi-Fi's a little bit more due to how the bass is, but I personally prefer how the bass sounds on the Soundstage Dioko. It really comes down to preference at this point, because while this does have more bass, I just think the bass presentation was just better on the Salnotes Dioko. Well, now that's pretty much all I have for these guys today, so I hope I didn't disappoint too many guys out there who bought these, because personally I enjoyed them a lot for gaming, but I know a lot of you guys out there also might not, and I can understand why after testing them out. You have to understand, just because something has been very well tuned for music, that doesn't necessarily mean it was very well tuned for gaming, which is probably also why gaming headsets and gaming earbuds sold for gaming sound kind of funky and not the greatest for music, because if you're testing those things for music, you're testing them wrong. Test them out for games, unless you're the Razer Tiamat, because we know how that disaster went out. More drivers doesn't necessarily mean a more immersive, better surround accurate sound. And with that being said, planar drivers doesn't necessarily mean better for gaming necessarily. It really all comes down to the tuning when it comes down to the planars, though. When it comes to those multi stuff from the Tiamat, that's a whole nother mess. For these guys, like I said, they're pretty good for music. They're really good for music. But for gaming, for me, I thought they were fine, but, like I said, for some of you guys, you probably won't find them as adequate. The world of audiophile equipment, where I just tell you the general ballpark of how these things will do, but your mileage will vary no matter what, because all our ears are different. So yeah, with that being said, if you do want to buy these guys, I will leave a link in the description in case you want to purchase this guy. I do get a kickback, I believe, if you do purchase on that link, and it helps me survive in this channel and life. So yeah, that also helps. So another thing that helps is if you like this video, in case this video did help you out with your purchase decision, or not purchase decision. Anyway, subscribe for more content if you want to see more content. Hit that bell thing if you want to know when I'm posting next. And yeah, I would talk more about my Twitch, but I think I'm just gonna leave that separate from here on out. Says whatever. If you find it, you find it. If you don't, you don't. I gotta focus more on this anyway. So, with that being said, that's pretty much all that I got. So, see you guys next time.